All right, so today we're diving into World War One.
Ooh.
Big topic, right?
Yeah.
And we've got this fascinating book by Juan Rabasseda, 1914-1918, Historia de la Primera Guerra Mundial. I always love saying the titles in the original language if I can.
Yeah.
But the really cool thing is we're going to be using this AI tool called Notebook LM to kind of help us sift through all this information and maybe even see some things that we wouldn't see as just humans, you know?
It's like having a personal AI historian
Exactly. It's like,
alongside us.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's going to be really cool to kind of see
Mm-hmm.
what it pulls out. So
Yeah. I'm excited to see how AI can kind of interact with the more traditional scholarship
right, exactly.
and yeah, what it brings to the table.
Yeah, because I mean, we could spend hours just talking about the basics of World War One.
Yeah.
I think our listeners are pretty familiar with
Yeah, they've got the basics.
the Sparkgents version.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of jump right in
Okay.
and talk about this idea of Sarajevo, right?
Yeah.
So Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated. Everyone knows that's what kicks off World War One. But is that really all it took?
Well, I mean, that's the question, right?
Yeah.
Was Europe just this powder keg waiting to explode? I think Rabasseda does a good job of showing that it's obviously more complicated than that. It's easy to kind of...
To oversimplify.
Yeah, to oversimplify and to look back and say, oh, well, of course, this tiny little event in the Balkans, caused this huge global conflict.
Yeah.
But I think what he highlights really well is this intricate web of alliances.
Right.
These treaties that nobody really understands, but they're all interconnected.
Right. And everyone's kind of like looking at each other sideways anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of pre-existing tension,
Right.
between the great powers. And so I think what Rabasseda is arguing is that, the assassination is a catalyst, but that the explosive potential was already there.
Interesting. So maybe powder keg isn't
Maybe not the best.
the worst analogy.
Yeah, maybe not totally off.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So we've got the spark.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this kind of powder keg ready to go.
Yeah.
The war kicks off.
Yep.
But, one of the things that I found fascinating in the book is how Rabasseda talks about these different fronts.
Oh, yeah.
Right, like the Western Front versus the Eastern Front.
Right, and they're so different.
So different. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so the Western Front, right? Everyone, we think about World War I, we think about trench warfare. It's just this brutal war of attrition.
Yeah.
Millions of soldiers.
Suck it.
Yeah, essentially trapped in these elaborate trench systems, and just this horrifying stalemate, for years, and just unimaginable casualties.
Right.
But then you contrast that with the Eastern Front, which was much more mobile,
Right.
vast, movements of troops, civilians across huge distances.
And it's interesting to me how that kind of reflects the
Yeah,
geography of
absolutely.
those different spaces.
Yeah, the vast plains of Eastern Europe versus the
Indicator.
the more confined spaces in the West. Yeah.
Right. And I think it's important to point out, too,
Mhm.
that World War One was this period of just massive technological advancement
Oh yeah,
in
excellent.
warfare.
I mean, you see the introduction of tanks,
Right.
chemical weapons,
Airplanes really being used.
Yeah, airplanes in a way that they'd never been used before.
Right.
And I think Rabasseda argues that this really changed the nature of war, and in some ways not for the better, right?
Right.
These technologies cast a very long shadow.
Yeah, on the rest of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
But, one of the things that I really appreciate about Rabasseda's book is he doesn't just focus on the big picture.
Right.
He also tells these really personal stories.
Oh yeah, he brings in the human element of the war, which I think is so important.
Yeah.
He talks about individual soldiers, huddled in the trenches, medics, working tirelessly, journalists, documenting the horrors, civilians caught in the crossfire.
Yeah. And I remember there's one story in particular about a French soldier
Yeah.
writing a letter home to his mother.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about the rats and the mud and just the
constant fear.
fear. Yeah. And it's just like,
Yeah.
that's what really brings it home.
Right.
The human cost of this conflict.
Exactly. And I think these narratives these personal stories, are so essential for understanding the true impact of the war.
Right.
Not just the grand strategies.
Right, the numbers, the battle.
Yep, exactly. But the individual courage, the resilience, but also the immense suffering and trauma.
Right. And speaking of impact, obviously World War I has this huge impact.
Right. It doesn't just end in 1918.
It doesn't end in 1918.
No.
The war ends, but the story doesn't end.
Right.
So talk to me a little bit about that, like what happens after the war?
Well, so, obviously you have the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which, everyone kind of breathes a sigh of relief. Okay, the war is over. We signed a treaty.
Good.
Everything's going to be fine.
Back to normal.
But Rabasseda actually, I think, makes a really compelling case that in many ways, the treaty actually laid the groundwork for future conflicts.
Interesting. How so?
Well, I mean, look at how Germany was treated, right? I mean, they were forced to accept full blame for the war.
Right.
They had to pay these massive reparations, which crippled their economy. And this created just widespread resentment among the German people.
Right.
And of course this isn't to excuse what happened later, but you can see how this bitterness, this humiliation contributed to the rise of extremist ideologies, including Nazism, which of course
ultimately led to World War II.
Exactly.
It's amazing to me how these seemingly isolated events or decisions can have these ripple effects that, extend for decades.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's actually where I think this AI analysis comes in.
Okay, yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how Notebook LM helped you navigate these connections.
So it's not that it replaced my own analysis, but it really helped to enhance it.
Okay.
I'll give you a specific example.
Yeah, please.
Notebook LM highlighted this really fascinating connection between the 1912 Albanian Revolt and Austria-Hungary's preparedness for war in 1914.
Interesting.
So, at first glance, we might think, well, a revolt in Albania.
Some old potatoes.
Yeah, that's a regional conflict. It doesn't really have much to do with the bigger picture. But what Notebook LM showed was that this revolt actually really strained Austria-Hungary's resources, and it potentially left them less prepared for the larger conflict to come.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's just one example, but...
So it's like having this research assistant.
Exactly.
That can just sift through all this
the
data.
mountains of data.
And be like, hey,
look at this.
Look at this connection.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
It's really powerful, and I think it helps us to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And to understand how even these seemingly unrelated events can have these unforeseen consequences.
Right.
But it is important to remember, that AI is a tool.
Right. It's
not a replacement for human historians.
Right.
It's still up to us to interpret these connections and to really, understand the nuances.
The context.
The historical context,
So as we kind of wrap up here, what do you think are the big takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think we've seen how this one event in Sarajevo,
seemingly isolated, could spark this global conflict,
and have these devastating consequences. And we've also, I think, explored how different the fighting was on these different fronts. And we've dove into these human stories that remind us of the real cost of war.
The human cost.
Yeah.
And I think it's also really cool how we've seen how AI can help us uncover these hidden connections. That we might not have seen otherwise.
And potentially deepen our understanding of history.
So really it's all about connections.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key takeaway is that our world is so interconnected that even small events, seemingly minor events, can have these ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate context.
And I think that kind of leads into this final thought that I want to leave our listeners with.
Okay.
We've talked about how AI can analyze all this data. But what if AI could analyze all historical data?
Ooh.
Like what else could we learn?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What other connections could we make?
Yeah, what would that do to our understanding of the past?
And also, I think it's important to think about,
Yeah.
How do we ensure we're using this technology responsibly?
Right. What are the biases that AI might bring?
Exactly. So World War I.
Mm-hmm.
It was a turning point in history.
Absolutely.
Its impact is still felt today.
Yes.
And we encourage you to keep learning.
Yeah.
Keep exploring this period.
It's fascinating.
And to never stop questioning the narratives that you encounter.
That's right. Always be curious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into World War I.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.